Hello and welcome to GYDA Initiative Talks. Today we are here with Sophie Bennett, a motivational expert, best-selling author, champion dressage rider and qualified ski instructor. In this episode, Robert Craven talks to Sophie about her latest book, Find Your Flame, Why Motivation Matters More Than Talent. It will give you insights into how it can help you as a digital agency leader.
Hello, it's Robert Craven here, the GYDA Initiative podcast. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to have not only a hero of mine and a guru, dare I say, but also a close friend, Sophie Bennett. So Sophie Bennett, I was thinking about how I could introduce her. Horse riding comes into it, Olympic comes into it, AI comes into it, working at Dell comes into it. There are so many points at which we could start talking about Sophie and who Sophie is. But Sophie, welcome. Who are you?
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us, what's a CV? What's the bio? How can we understand who you are?
Okay, so I suppose in a way I'm a bit of a closet geek because I was a professional rider, as you mentioned, until the late 1990s, and then got given a weird job without really knowing what the job was because nobody understood it either. So for any of your agency owners that are old enough to remember the days of Alta Vista and Yahoo browsers, I sort of came into it around that time, just as we were making the transition from IBM XTs, you know, the ones with the black screens and the little matrix, little green letters on the screen. So pre-Windows. So I've been around and about the computing industry since the late 90s. So I've always followed it with interest and ended up a period doing content management, intelligent content management for Dell. I've been a bid writer for the oil and gas industry. And I've always done modular content. So I see content as data and data as content, if that makes sense. So I'm a content person, but I'm also a bit of a closet geek. And in a way, my career has always been about being the bridge between the geek and the people who don't understand geek, who just need the computers to do stuff for us. So even as a speaker now, really, I'm that bridge between the technical and the real world, if you like, where people don't necessarily understand what drives the car. They don't know what's under the bonnet, they just know where they want to go.
I love the fact you use the word drive, because I think one of the conversations we had, I think probably on a ski lift at some point, was in terms of what is it that drives people? And then we kind of refined it and we started talking about the idea of driven people. Now, I take no credit because you were talking to lots of people. But could you maybe tell us about the book and tell us how that applies to the agency world, maybe?
Yeah, well, you definitely gave me a lot of encouragement about the idea for the book, so I thank you for that because it was quite early in the project. So the book and how it applies to agency owners.
What's the name of the book? Give us the name.
Okay, so the name of the book is Find Your Flame: Why Motivation Matters More Than Talent. Because it does, and to get that big elephant out of the room straight away, the reason it matters more than talent is eventually talent always runs out. Because there's always going to be somebody just as talented as you are who's got more drive, more motivation, more passion, more energy. So that's the stuff really that I see that makes people successful over the long term. And I wanted to work with driven people. I've always been around them in sport, in business. I was fortunate enough to work with Michael Dell directly on a couple of projects that he was sort of spearheading, where he was a public face. And that passion that came from Michael once you get him out of the public eye where he's a little bit awkward, because he's not that socially comfortable, but he's highly technical and he's very visionary. He gets super, super excited, and that energy is contagious. So whenever Michael Dell walked into the room, the whole room started off listening to the technical stuff. And as soon as he started talking about where the tech was taking people, he just lit up, completely changed the energy in the room. So those highly driven people were the people I really wanted to spend more time around. So the book was a bit of a cheat because it gave me the chance to do that. I interviewed 50 of them and started to get some clues as to how the most successful people, A, get there, and B, how they sustain it. Because that's the kicker, isn't it? It's no good being successful for a season. You have to keep doing it week in, week out.
Your definition of driven people. I mean, and you quote Dell, which is great because everyone knows who Michael Dell is, and it kind of makes sense in the same way that people always quote Richard Branson, and they used to quote Anita Roddick and so on and so forth as the driven people. But do you think that person running a 25 or 50 person agency is just as driven or not as lucky? Or I mean, how are there league tables of drivenness just because you've not been? I mean, how does it work?
Well, number one, I think it's a process, not an event, right? So success over the long term isn't an outcome, it's a way of being. It's something that you do every day. So a quote that I remember from years and years ago, which I love, which is getting happiness is getting what you want. True success is wanting what you get.
Say it again. Happiness.
Actually, it's the other way around. It's success. It's because I didn't have it written down. We're just having a chat, right? Yeah. It's success is getting what you want. Happiness is wanting what you get.
Okay.
Because we all have this impression of what our success is going to give to us, and then often, not all the time, but often people get there and they look around and think, hang on a minute, this isn't what I bought into. So agency owners, any business people will know this. You strive and strive and strive to make your business a success. Oh. And then I hear it a lot that people wake up and think, hang on a minute, this isn't what I signed up for, because they haven't necessarily planned all the things. They didn't realize what success looked like up there. More responsibility, more hassle, more cost, more risk, less rest, less time with the family. And it's often the reverse of what people expected to get. So success is getting what you want. Happiness is wanting what you get. And the people I interviewed were people who were very happy with what that had delivered in the main. Life's never that black and white, but generally the really driven people that I was fortunate enough to interview had that real zest for life. They'd worked their way through that stuff, and they were at the point where they were happy with what they'd got. It was very interesting to see how they got there.
So I always make that quote. If you want to know what God thinks of money, look at the people He gives it to. And part of the reason I give that quote is because I see quite a few highly driven, highly successful people, and I wouldn't want their life or their lifestyle. I mean, that's not to say that's not to say that I'm right and they're wrong. I'm just saying that the cost they pay socially often seems to be really high. Second, third marriages, children all over the place, and so on and so forth. But what you're saying is there are some people who get most of the bits of the jigsaw puzzle in place.
Yeah, so I'll go back to the content of the book for a moment because it was really interesting and it was very unexpected, because I initially thought I was going to do a collection of interviews, get some original stories, share those with an audience, and also the plan was always to look at the science behind it. So there's lots and lots of studies about motivation, about people in work, people outside work. And Dan Pink had done some great work on that. He wrote a book called Drive, and his big 3 tenets were mastery, autonomy, and purpose. They were the 3 things that we all needed to feel driven and happy with our results. But when I did the interviews, something different was going on. There was like a little golden thread. People started talking about early experiences. And I thought, hang on a minute, this isn't matching the data from all the previous studies. And because I have an NLP background from many years ago, I sort of look for the data behind stuff. So I was looking for a pattern, and there was one. And it turned out that the most successful, satisfied and driven people they were all pursuing a feeling that when I dug around, they'd had very early on in life that had given them some sort of satisfaction, some sort of kick, and they designed a life around getting more of that. But what they didn't always do is follow the same path to get it. So let me give you an example. Some people had a very strong winning streak, had experienced something like, winning a school sports day or winning an academic prize or something. They'd won something, got some praise, been rewarded or recognised. They'd put their head above the parapet, if you like, and they'd remembered that feeling. And then they became very competitive to get it. And it was a pattern, whether they went into sales, whether they owned a business, whether they did sport at weekends, whether they sailed a boat in their spare time, they were winners because they were chasing that constant feeling of satisfaction, getting it that way through a winning route. Others did it because they found a great sense of teamwork, maybe when they were kids or they came from a big family and they were always trying to connect people together. And those people had really strong networks. They were great at building teams. So I decoded there were about 5 different patterns of behavior. There were a few more, but by the time you put them together in a coherent lump, big enough for people to remember and use, there were 5 core strategies. So briefly, the first one was a flow feeling. That was people who get on the zone, who just drop everything else, who just dive in. And probably some of your agency owners, I suspect, are in that camp, because it's very individual. It's very focused on one thing to the exclusion of everything else. So great software programmers often get into flow. Great sports people do, interestingly. And that whole thing where the frontal cortex shuts down, all the distractions drop away, and you just are totally into something, that's flow drive. And you find people will apply that strategy to everything they do, whether it be reading a book, writing code, collecting stuff, doesn't matter, playing music, they get totally into it. So flow drive was one. The second one was inclusion motivation, inclusion drive, and that was the networky, social coherence, that team building. And there's one of those people usually in most firms, but they don't necessarily have seniority. And you can have invisible networks, and if you want to find somebody with the power, you just ask somebody who they know, and they'll guaranteed be able to give you a phone number, know somebody who does that. And in your teams, they don't necessarily always speak up, but you need to know who they are, because if you don't, and then they're not happy, of course, that spreads out in a way that you don't want it, because their networks are very powerful. The third one was the results motivated people, who we spoke about already. The fourth ones are expression motivated. And they're I suppose they're your goth, they're your touchy-feely people. They're about connecting to the human condition. So they write poetry, they act, they can be very expressive. They're often great copywriters because they understand the emotional impact of stuff on people. And without those people, you can't connect to an audience. So they're really important in your business, but not always respected by the results motivated people who just want numbers and goalposts and goals and everything. So they're not always compatible, but they both need to coexist. And then the last one is discovery motivation, which is all about asking great questions. And any great research or data analyst will have to do that, because they always have to know what questions to ask of the data. Because there's no good just having the data, you need to know what to look for inside the data, which interestingly is where AI is starting to really get some traction. Reading some really interesting papers at the moment about AI finding stuff, particularly in the finance world, where they're correlating things that no human being would actually look for, but AI will go and look for. So if you have 3 takeaways a week, apparently you're more likely to pay your debts than if you don't have any takeaways. Ludicrous stuff. correlations that supposedly should have no impact on the outcome, but do. Because they're getting such huge amounts of data now from, particularly I'm reading some really interesting stuff coming out of the Far East, because everything is very, very data driven, because they've got they use QR codes, and they're doing more and more transactions through the WeChat app, so that the online offline world is getting very blurred, which means that whether they hire a bike, get a takeaway, buy a newspaper, it's all going through the app, which means you're getting a much clearer insight into people's behavior. They haven't got this online behavior and then an offline behavior through cash, because they're doing everything through WeChat wallets. So AI is building this vast lake of data, and they're starting to be able to predict how one behavior connects to something else. So you need curious minds to start seeing that stuff.
So what are people? Are people a dominant D or a dominant? Well, first of all, let's go through the letters. But are they a dominant D for discovery, or do they have a mix? I mean, how do we use? So can you just go through them very quickly?
Yeah, brilliant. So it's an easy one to remember because it spells FIRED, F-R-I-E-D, like as in fired up, motivated. Flow motivation, inclusion motivation, results motivation, expression motivation, discovery motivation, F-R-I-E-D. Easy.
Okay.
So each one of those has got a behavior associated with it. And this is some really interesting work that I'm only just starting to really dig into, which is how useful that knowledge can be. Because each of those motivation types are states rather than personality traits. So they're states, not traits.
Okay.
Because you can have whatever type of personality you have, but if you get into a certain state, a highly curious state, or you get into a highly results-driven state, your biochemistry changes, your brainwave changes, your heart rate changes, everything changes. So you think of results motivation, it's very adrenaline-driven, right? If you think of inclusion motivation, it's very oxytocin-driven, where you're bonding and connecting with people. So each of the one that you drift to most naturally, because we all have a big one that's our sort of default setting, and a secondary one that balances with it. So let me give you an example of that. One of the people I interviewed for the book, a guy called Carl Hester. Now, Carl has won 2 gold medals, one in London in 2012. He won team silver at Rio. He's won an individual silver in the European Championships, ridden at 5 Olympic Games, and trains and coaches the current Olympic gold medalist from Rio, world record holder, World Cup holder, European Championship holder. The accolades are huge. Now, Carl is flow driven, very, very highly flow driven, and he won't break state in order to win a medal. And he talks about himself coming in comfortable second place behind Charlotte because he doesn't want to break the state. Whereas Charlotte has the same 2 things. He's still highly results driven. He's ridden at 5 Olympic Games. You don't get there without a competitive edge, right? But his pupil, the current world medalist, is results driven first, flow driven second. So she will break rapport with a horse. I've watched her do it. She will cover things up in the arena in order to win. And as a team, they're a brilliant team because he keeps her in flow and she keeps the eyes on the prize, and he will sit back. So they have the same 2 dominant ones, but in a slightly different order, and the outcome is very different. So that's the answer, is that we all have one big one and a secondary one that balances with it, and that sort of keeps us on a level. We all, of course, get into the other 3 states occasionally all the time. So we all have a bit of each of them in us, but we'll have a dominant one and a secondary one that really drives how we behave, how the choices that we make.
So do you think that? So I think there's loads of things going through my head, but one of them is this sense that we as entrepreneurs, people who run our own businesses, are different from people who take the wage and spend the weekend just hitting golf balls or whatever it is they do. Because when you run your own business, you seem to be in the zone one way or another all time. So do entrepreneurs, business owners, people who are being entrepreneur, being opportunistic, do they have a different, is it a bit like Myers-Briggs, where the entrepreneurs have a certain sort of profile which is different from the ordinary profile? Do driven people have a different profile?
That's a really great question. I'd love to map that, actually. I think there always has to be a higher level of results drive for entrepreneurs because the levels of risk we have to take. So nobody's going to be driven to get results without having to take a level of risk that goes with that. So without the results drive, I don't think you'd undertake all the stresses and strains and risks that you have to.
Those results can be, I mean, if you're, I'm just thinking, if you aren't comfortable, there's still the risk attached to employing 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 people, even if you're not all about the money and all about the awards and so on and so forth. There are easier ways of earning £100,000 than employing 20 or 30 people. So there's still that drug, which is entrepreneurship. I guess I guess it results in the broadest sense of running my own business, being in charge of my own destiny, not having someone wagging their finger and telling me what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, whether you look at entrepreneurs or sport, when you look in that results drive quadrant, one of the attributes of that is that those people who make a real success of it, whether they run great businesses, whether they win series of medals, whatever it is that they're outstanding in results in their field, is that they are radically self-accountable.
Okay, that's it. That's the piece, because that's the bit that's why you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning going, if, would, should, then, could, but, then, if. Whether you employ 30, 300, 3,000, 30,000 people, it's my role in making that happen.
Radical self-accountability, and it all starts with self, because if you don't hold yourself accountable, how can you expect people underneath you in the pyramid hold themselves accountable? You have to lead from the front. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily doing all the work. So in entrepreneurship, I want to make that distinction really, really clear. There's a difference. Let's take my friend Carl Hester, for example. Carl does not muck his own stables out, right? He does not drive his own horse box to the shows. He does not groom the horses and do all the stuff that goes with it. However, that is a pretty serious business, and they turn over several million. A good dressage horse will sell for upwards of £5 million. It's a serious business, and yards of that level will cost something of a small business to keep going. Like 300,000-400,000 a year just to maintain the facilities. So that's without investing in the business and people and travel and everything else.
Okay, so pulling it together, because I'm trying to get all the bits of the jigsaw puzzle in my mind. I'm sure the people listening and watching likewise. Theory, book, 5, got it.
Yeah.
Understand that definition. How do people use the book? How do people just go, oh, I'm definitely all D's, I'm going to read about D? Do they read about the whole thing? Are there worksheets? I mean, how does the book translate into people behaving I guess that's the word, isn't it? People behaving differently.
Differently, absolutely. The book itself is actually full of lots of case studies and little stories of people and the science that goes with it to make sense of why we do what we do. So the book is a self-exploration, I guess, of because everybody who reads it will have a different experience from it because it's written that way. So you will see your own comparisons and learn from other people who've maybe done what you would like to do. So there's that element directly from the book. From my learnings of it since it's gone out into the wild, because that's when you really start to learn about your material, right? It's when people start to use it, is that these individual elements that stand out for each motivation type are really what makes the shift in people. So the results one is a great example. You have to be radically self-accountable to be successful on a continual basis. That does not mean you have to do all the work yourself, but you have to take responsibility that happens for all the work that happens as a result of your leadership. So if you don't communicate something to somebody and they don't do what you want them to do, it's not their fault, it's your fault. That's radical self-accountability. Result-based people are radically self-accountable. Carl doesn't muck his own stables out, but if it's not done properly, he takes responsibility because he hasn't trained somebody, he hasn't communicated. So it's that element of radical self-accountability that is very different about results-driven people. Let's just go around the 5 in a minute. So flow-driven people have a great natural skill for getting in the zone. They're brilliant at focusing on stuff. Brilliant. Inevitably, that means that they miss some stuff around the periphery. Because when you're very narrowly focused, you're not seeing what's going on at the side of you. Inclusion-based people are great at seeing what's going on all around them in their network, but they're not necessarily the most focused.
Yes.
Results-based people are very radically self-accountable, but they aren't necessarily always that good at empathizing with people. Expression-based people are great at communicating. They're brilliant at getting a message across, and they're often great at listening, but they're not always very focused, very results-driven, very self-accountable, because they're a little bit away with the fairies. But you need that because you need to connect with people at an emotional level in your company or with your customers. Because if you don't connect here, at some point you just lose people because they're looking for an emotional connection as well as getting a job done, right? And discovery-based people are your innovators. They're your grit in the oyster. They ask the difficult questions. And discovery-based leaders can be fascinating to work with because they have an energy about them. They're your Brian Coxes, your David Attenboroughs, your Steve Jobses, who just don't follow the groove. They just plough their own path because they're always asking great questions, but they can be a bit awkward to work with sometimes because they're very focused on what they see as a future, but they're not necessarily that great at integrating what's going on right now. So there's a quality to everybody, and I'm sure everyone listening to this will recognize something about themselves in one of those descriptions. What's interesting is that the more mature leaders that I interviewed who had been through difficult experiences and were still driven and still optimistic had learned to round themselves out. So they had realized that their focus was an asset, but they needed to learn to get on with people. Being results driven was great and it got the company so far, but if they wanted to really expand, they needed to reach hearts as well as minds and wallets. And they actually literally rounded out. So if you put those 5 on a pie chart, you'd end up with a spider diagram of somebody being super strong in results and flow, and then 3 empty bits in the other sectors. As people got more mature and got more effective and often more successful, they literally rounded out their diagram. So they filled in the gaps. They learned to focus when it wasn't their strong points. They learned to develop relationships and build networks, or hire people that could do it for them. Because for entrepreneurs, it's not necessarily the case that you need to be everything. Obviously, you can't be everything, but that you then get an active choice with the 5 ways of being, the 5 motivators. Do I improve that part of myself, or do I hire for that? And it becomes a conscious decision in the business what you do to be most successful. Do you hire that gap, or do you fill it yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's meant to be complimentary. But it's quite in some sense, it's quite a tough read because it's not a silver bullet read. It doesn't just say, and here's the answer on a silver plate. Just, eat your greens or whatever it is. And it's one of those books that you have to do a bit of contemplating and a bit of reflecting on, because it's that Johari window thing where you you can't see all of yourself and other people can. So and what it does is it just has these little knives which dig into your ribs, saying, really, are you really good at that? And really, is that what you really need to do? And really, is that what, is that what you need to do? So for me, it was a slightly, I mean, it was a reassuring but slightly uncomfortable read, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I actually think I've written the second book first. Because it's actually a deep dive before the whole principles are exposed. So it's a summer project, actually, Robert. I'm going to work on just writing a very short, compressed version of what those 5 things are, what those 5 behaviors are, what the 5 kryptonites are for each one, of course, because we have demotivators as well as motivators. And that's a really interesting one for people with teams, because you can be unwittingly demotivating people without knowing it if they have a different motivation from you. So I think that's, justifiably going to get into a 30-page sort of cartoon-based, very visual book that almost needs to come in front of Find Your Flame.
So how did people? I mean, the book's been out for a year now.
It came out. They're about 6-9 months, a little while.
I guess it feels longer because I was speaking to you before the book came out. How are people using the book?
Well, that's what's surprising me. I give away, when I go out speaking, I give away a little infographic, just a little card of all the 5 flames. And I've been blown away by how people are using it, because they never do what you expect with it. I had one company who gave it one to all of their team, and they started using it as a way of mapping their day, which I thought was a bit bizarre. I would never have thought about it. So they started off getting in flow in the morning, getting everybody in the zone, concentrating. Then they had an inclusion break in the middle of the morning to make sure everybody felt part of the team. Nobody was being left out, sat in a corner. Then at lunchtime, they checked the results to see if they were on target. This was a candle maker, which I thought was hilarious for a thing called Fired Up, a mnemonic called Fired Up.
Boom, boom.
Yeah, brilliant. Ignition. And then in the afternoon, they used the expression flame to say, what can we do better with the process? Has everybody got a voice? Anybody got any good ideas? And they did actually find that some of their team, when encouraged to speak up, had some great stuff to say, but they weren't being given a voice. I would never have thought of that. So they actually worked through it during the day. And the end of the day, they did a little round robin 5 minutes at the close. Has anybody got any great questions or any great ideas about how we might innovate and do something differently? And within about 6 weeks, apparently they'd changed their processes. They'd upped their production by about 12% because they just cut some little corners off. They moved things around the factory. The team was functioning better. So that was one example. I actually used it as a structure to make sure they hit all the bases with their people and with their processes. So I thought that was great. Some people use it to read their teams better. I know when I've done workshops on this, I did one a few weeks ago for 50 healthcare professionals. And we had a couple of comments like, I've got somebody in my team and I never really got them before. And now I think I know where I was getting it wrong. So they were just able to read their behaviors because of what they'd heard. I had a couple of people on that particular session who recognized some leadership weaknesses of their own, who decided that they were going to make a conscious effort to go and improve their communication skills or improve their listening skills.
You work with some accountants, so I think for me they're the toughest ones. If you can stand up in front of accountants and make them smile, then you're on to a winner. So what happened with the accountants? I mean, that must be one of the toughest gigs. I mean,
well, because very results focused. Because results focused people love measurements and goals and targets, and the worst thing you can do with those people is move the goalposts or make things fluffy. So, as quite a flow-driven person myself, I'm a little bit in the wrong room with accountants, one would think. But actually, they got the fact that they recognise themselves often in that results-driven thing. What most of them realised is they had something outside work that connected to one of the other sectors. And actually, if they could bring that into work, they would become more rounded as people. So not to leave their expression stuff at home that they sing in a choir, to not leave their focus about other things outside work and just be results focused. They could actually talk to people. They could actually actively build networks. They could stand up and present their ideas more confidently. So I think the accountants realised that their results drive was only a small part of who they were, and that they could bring more of themselves to work. And it produced a lot of interesting conversations. And as soon as people get talking, it's amazing what stuff comes out of it.
So there's a piece which is about me as leader, as owner founder, and who I am and what I am. There's a piece around understanding the people around me, my senior team, heads of the board, whatever they are. But also there's a piece around how I interrelate with them. So there's the two bits of it there. And then you're saying, which is blindingly obvious, but I hadn't thought about it. There's also a piece that kind of trickles down through the business, so that it's not just about, there's always that dreadful business school thing about the difference between leadership and management. But we're all mini driven leaders in our own lifetime. So whether it's
we've all got these forces all going on all the time, and they're all pulling at us from different directions. And I think if you're leading a business, if you're leading anything, actually, if you're leading people, one of the things that we all have to develop over time is a clear sense of identity of our leadership style, of who we are, because that sets the tone of what people expect you to deliver, what your customers see, what your staff come into work expecting you to be and to deliver. So anything that helps people to establish that identity, that style of leadership, that way of doing things that is consistent, and that people see you as a predictable human being, that allows stuff to happen around you more effectively. I think for agency owners and for people who are running businesses, whatever the size, there's a lot of responsibility and a lot of stress. And one of the big temptations is to sort of flow with the stress and express that. Now, I'm not saying be this machine that never changes, because we're not machines, we're humans. But people do expect of leaders a level of consistency so they can build trust and behave around them openly enough to be able to talk about stuff that's going on in the business. So identity and leadership is personal development, isn't it? It's learning to show up in the right way consistently so that people around you will tell you what's really going on, trust you to be counsel, know that you are there to help them solve their problems, whether that be customers or team. And that's an ongoing process. We all have to keep getting stronger in our identity, more sure of ourselves, and able to hold our ground when going gets tough. So the 5 Flames are just one of those tools to help people find their identity, develop who they are, be a bit more certain about how they behave around other people, how they show up for themselves. Because ultimately that's whether it's leadership or management, you need those qualities for people around you to be of their best, right? It's a personal development tool, but it's a very simple one. It's on an infographic, it's on a card.
If I was to ask you, maybe this might help you with the cartoon book coming out soon. For agency owners, what are the if you took them to the pub or a restaurant and they wanted to know, what are the big takeaways, what are the big tips, what are the big messages that you want to make sure they understand? What are the messages you want to land in their brains about?
Okay, the biggest one would be people are frightened of geeks. Customers are frightened of geeks. So an owner of an agency, one of the biggest roles I think there is to actually cross that divide, is to be that bridge between the data that drives the business and that gives us success for the customers, because you are there to understand the data, to advise on the data, to read the data, to predict the data. It's a very data-driven business. That's what you're there to do as a service. But actually, you can't sell that service or really get to the people who need it unless you're that human bridge. And people are frightened of geeks. So you have to be human to your customers. You have to learn to speak to customers and team in a way that allows people not to be frightened of geeks. Because as soon as people withdraw into Geeksville, I know this from working with quite a few IT companies, Dell, Fujitsu, HP, some others, that there is like a division between the people that know their technical stuff and the people out front. And what an owner needs to do is to actually be able to bridge those two worlds, because that's where real success really comes from. So I don't think you ever stop learning your communication skills, how to simplify the concepts that you're trying to sell, because people are frightened of geeks. So it's all about simplifying that, upping your communication skills. And in the context of the 5 flames, it's really, you're probably as an agency owner great at focusing, or you wouldn't have started an agency. You're probably pretty self-accountable, so you're probably good at results, delivering results. And I would imagine that a lot of agency owners fall into that profile, or potentially the discovery profile. But expression and actually communicating that, being the bridge, might not be a strong point for everyone. And inclusion and building that team and finding that very broad network. You might be good at it within other experts, but not necessarily as good at being it to the outside world. I think they're probably the two that I would say. That's where to ask yourself the big questions. Are you being a great bridge? Are you seen as a geek? Because that will limit the people that you can do business with.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic, Sophie. Big takeaway from me, which kind of went straight through the head and out the other end. I mean, not touching anything in the middle, but leaving a message, is about self-accountability. I kind of never really thought about self-accountability, and as in, I just assumed everyone felt hugely responsible about everything that went on around them, and that's why they're up at 3 a.m. But actually, you've actually nailed it. Self-accountability is the piece. Any final thoughts, wishes, or messages for our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, just have a bit of fun with the 5 flames. Just when you're in flow, notice it. When you're in a group and it's all ticking along and your team is buzzing, just notice what's going on. When you get that great result, notice what you did before. When you're being really expressive, notice what you did to get there. And when you ask a great question, notice the thought processes. Because that personal development bit, really just about being more self-aware, is where all your growth is going to come from.
Brilliant, Sophie. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing some insights into the book, the URL, all the details are going to come in at the end of the podcast, so you can get hold of Sophie, which I thoroughly recommend you do. And in the meantime, thank you everyone very much for listening and watching, but especially thank you very much, Sophie, for being our guest. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Rob. It's been great fun.
Bye.
Bye now.